So I got started with my solution here, and to continue, I now want to change the background color, because in the expected solution that I showed you before, I wanted to have a nice gradient background. And that is of course also something that we already implemented in the previous course section. So in order to add this gradient, we can wrap the start screen widget with the container widget, because that container widget will then allow us to set a decoration on it. And I will indeed wrap the start screen widget instead of putting the container into the start screen widget, since, as mentioned earlier, I want to use the same screen setup and screen background for all the screens I'm about to add. And therefore I'll not put it into a specific screen, but instead wrap it around this screen. Now to wrap a widget around my custom start screen widget, I can right click on it and choose this refactor option, and then wrap this with a container. So choose this option here. With that, we add this container widget, and we are now forced to remove const here because container does not support it, at least not at the point of time I'm recording this. But I can add it in front of start screen still, because that's inside of the container, and my custom start screen widget does support const because of this const constructor. And on container, we now can add more options than just child. We can and should, for example, add the decoration option, which allows us to add a box decoration object by using the box decoration constructor function, which then in turn can be used to set a gradient. And that's exactly what I want to do here. And here I'll again go for a linear gradient as I did it in the previous section, and format this code a little bit. And to this linear gradient constructor function, which will create such a linear gradient configuration object, which then is used by box decoration and ultimately by container, we can pass a colors argument. So a named argument with the name colors. And colors wants a list of colors, and you learned about this list type in the previous course section as well. It's a generic type, which simply means that we got one type, list in this case, which works together with another type, and it is quite flexible regarding which exact type that is. Here it's the type color, but you could in other places of your app also have lists of strings or numbers or any other values, but here it's a list of colors. And such a list is created by using square brackets, and then between those square brackets you put your list values. And that should at least be 2 colors to create a nice gradient. And to pick those colors, I'll start with a nice deep purple maybe, like in the last course section. And if you then hover over that, you should get a nice color picker here in Visual Studio Code. And I will now choose a, well, again, relatively dark purple color, but a bit more purplish than in the last section. And then copy that color and add it again as a second value in that list, but now hover over that second color here and choose a different purple tone, like that. Now we can add const here, since all these configuration objects do have const constructors and therefore can use this optimization technique here by adding const in front of them when created as objects, so when the constructor functions are called. And with that, if we save this and we force an update on the emulator, I do indeed have some purple here, but that's of course not what I intended. I'd like to have this on the entire screen instead. Well, for that we first of all have to pick some content inside of the container that really occupies the entire screen. And this text widget at the moment does not do that. Instead, that only occupies as much space as is needed to display this text. Now that can be changed by wrapping it with another widget, to be precise, the center widget. This center widget, as its name implies, centers its child widget, its content. So in this case, this text widget inside of it, both horizontally and vertically. And in order to do that, the center widget will try to get as much space as it can. And since this center widget is in the end the first widget used inside of that container that's inside of scaffold, it will in the end take up the entire available screen, because neither scaffold nor container do by default take up any space themselves. Therefore, center will basically expand to take the entire screen width and height, and hence the surrounding scaffold and container widgets will apply their settings and their decorations to the center widget. That's how this here works, and by using center here, we'll make sure that we get the background color on the entire screen. So here I'll add a comma and move this const keyword here in front of center, since center also supports it. And now with that, this looks much better. Now this indeed does take up the entire screen. Now I'd like to have the gradient flow from the top left to the bottom right corner, as I had it in the previous course section, and for that, back in main.dart we can go back to the linear gradient constructor function and not just pass a colors argument, but also a begin argument, which wants an alignment geometry value, which can be created by using alignment, and then you could manually enter some coordinates here, or use one of these predefined values by using the dot notation directly on the alignment class. And here I'll use top left as a begin value, and for add I'll use alignment bottom right, like this. And with that, if I save this, now this gradient indeed flows from the top left to the bottom right corner. So that's looking better. Of course, that's still not all though. Inside of the start screen, I now wanted to have three main elements, if you take another look at the expected solution. I wanted to have an image, then below that some text, and then below that a button. And when you have a scenario like this, where you want to have multiple widgets above each other or next to each other, you might want to use column for widgets above each other or row for widgets next to each other. Now we'll see row in action later in this section. For the moment it's column that we need, since I want to have multiple widgets laid out on the screen vertically. And column wants a children argument, an argument named children, which then in turn wants a list of widgets. So we create a list with square brackets, and in there we then define all the widgets that should make up this column. Now column does not support the const keyword, hence you should remove it here to get rid of this error. And now we can get started adding our widgets here. And I'll start with an image. I did provide that image earlier in this section already. It's this assets zip file, which you found attached to lecture 2 in this lecture. In that assets folder, you find a subfolder named images. And in that images subfolder, you have this quiz logo PNG file. And it's now this image which I want to output here. And to output such an image, it's not enough to just add it to your project. Instead, as you learned in the previous course section, you also have to go to your pubspec.yaml file. And in there, if you scroll down, you should find this assets section, which you should comment in so that it is active. And then there, below assets, after hitting the tab key once to indent this, you should add a dash and then basically list all your assets, all your images, for example, that should be usable in this Flutter app. And for that, you specify the relative project path to that asset. So in my case, assets/images/ and then the name of the image. And once you did that, this asset can be used in your code. And you can use this image asset and display it with help of the image widget, which is also built into Flutter. The image widget can be constructed like this, and then you would have to provide an image argument which wants an image provider. But if you have an asset, a locally stored image that should be displayed, it's easier to display that by using another constructor function offered by the image widget class, and that would be the asset constructor function. To that, you simply pass a string created with these single quotes that contains the path to the image that should be displayed. So in this case, assets/images/quiz logo.png, and you're good to go. If you now add a comma here for better formatting, and you then save everything, this image should be displayed on the screen. At the moment, it's a little bit too big though. I'd like to shrink it and I'd like to center it vertically. Now to shrink it, you can pass another named argument to this image asset constructor function, and that would be the width argument. And here you can set a width in pixels, for example 300. If you do that, the image will be shrunk. Now to center it, since we are already here in a center widget, you can simply go to your column and there set the main axis size to main axis size.min, so that instead of taking all the available vertical space, which it will do by default, the column widget will only take as minimal vertical space as needed, so only the height of this image in this case. And main axis size refers to the vertical size because for a column the main axis is the vertical axis. So with that, this image is now in the center. Of course, this image was just one of the widgets that should be added here inside of this column, and it's therefore time to also add the 2 remaining widgets. Hence, next I want to add some text, since some text should be displayed below the image. And here the text that should be displayed is "Learn Flutter the fun way." Like this, and here you can add const in front of it, since this text widget can be optimized. Now if I do that, this text indeed does show up here, but it got a couple of problems. For one, it's way too close to the image. It would be better to have some spacing between image and text. And of course, I also want this text to be a bit bigger and to have a white color or some color that's a bit easier to see in front of this purple background. Now for the spacing, you can, for example, add a sized box as an extra widget between the image and this text widget. Sized box is simply a widget where you as a developer can define the exact size of the widget so that it does not take all the available space like center does, or just as much space as the content needs, as text does, but that it instead takes exactly that amount of space that you tell it to take. And here we could, for example, set the height argument, so pass a value for the named height argument of, let's say, 80. You can then also add const in front of this, and with that we got some spacing here, which is good. Now, of course, I also want to change the text color and size, and that can be done by going to the text widget and adding the style argument. This, as you learned in the previous section, should be set to a value of type text style, and such a value can be created with the text style constructor function that is provided by Flutter. So we're using a built-in class here provided by Flutter. And to this text style constructor function, you can, for example, pass a color value and set this to white as a color. Or maybe if you want to get fancy, pick a color that is maybe some very light whitish purple, something like this. We can give this a try as well. I also wanted to increase the font size, and for this we can use the font size argument here and set this maybe to 24. If you do that and save everything, the text is now bigger and easier to read. Now, last but not least, I want to have a button below that text that can be clicked to then later start the quiz. And here in the expected solution, I actually wanted to have a button that has a visible border. So for that, I'll first of all add a comma here and format this to make this easier to read. But then below this text widget, I'll add another sized box widget to add some extra space between the text and the button. And this can be const and can again have a height of, let's say, 30. Let's see if this works. And below this, we can then add the button. And for adding a button that has a visible border, we can go to the widget catalog provided by Flutter. And there, under Material Components, we find a Buttons area. And in that area, we, for example, find this outlined button, which looks like the kind of button I want to use here. So to use it, we can then create it here, outlined button. And to the onPressed argument, I'll simply pass an empty anonymous function right now. You learned that you can create anonymous functions like this in the last section as well. So this is how you can create a function that is only available here in this place and that's passed as a value to the onPressed argument. But since it contains no code in the function body, this function won't do anything here. Of course, we're going to change this later. But first I want to go to my child here and set this to a text widget so that we can define the text that should be shown on this button. And here I'll just add a text of start quiz. And this can be turned into a constant object by adding the const keyword. Now with that, we have that button here, but I'm not too happy with the styling. So to change the styling, we can add a style argument here. And this should be set to a button style. And whilst you can construct a button style manually with the button style class provided by Flutter, the easier way of doing that, which you also kind of saw in the last section already, there just with text button instead of outlined button, but the easier way, which works for outlined button as well, is to use the outlined button class and there call the built-in style from method. And style from then makes it a bit easier to apply various style settings to this button. For example, here we can set the foreground color, which will be the text color in the end, and set this, for example, to white. And with that, the button looks like this now, and the text is way easier to read. And that's the final solution for this exercise. That's where we're going to continue in the next lecture to learn more about Flutter, available widgets, available configuration options, and much more. But this is the solution to the exercise, and this also was a quick summary of some core concepts and widgets about which you learned in the previous course section. Therefore, it's now time to continue and learn some new things.